They talk about backward design. They talk about a lot about assessment. And they follow what's called the GRASPS framework, which stands for goal, role, audience, situation, purpose or process or products, and standards. And so I wanted to share here an example of a performance task. Again, this is for assessment, and the idea using a backward design is to try to come up and develop an assessment actually before one begins instruction. Before you begin the class, that you have an idea of what kind of assessments that you're going to incorporate during the class. And so performance test is certainly one type of performance, or one type of assessment rather, that one can choose from as a teacher. Of course, there are others, tests, quizzes. You can consider just informal feedback, checking homework, even just classroom observation through asking questions. All of these are different examples or ways in which one can assess students. Today, though, I want to talk about specifically performance tasks and looking at the GRASP framework to see an example of kind of a framework. This is not a lesson plan. It's very general by design so that one can look at the ideas shared in this particular example and then adapt it to one's own context. So if we look at this example of nutrition, we have an essential question which states as follows: how much of a healthy and sustainable dietary plan is dependent on well-established research versus one's own routine and dietary likes and dislikes? So I think it's important to mention at this point that the nutrition, this type of performance task, is really designed for approximately 20 hours of study. So in my particular case, the class that I had in mind meets 5 hours a week. So basically this is going to be a 1 month time frame where students are not only working on this task, of course, right, that they are working though to prepare or enable them in order to be successful in this performance task. So again, this performance task might only occur at the very end of the unit, at the very end of the month of study, but the idea is that other types of activities and drills and instructions and basically all the other types of activities that they're going to do over the course of a month are all going to link back to this idea of nutrition, specifically what they're expected to do for the performance test. So as I go through some of the elements of this example, I think it's important to think about how to prepare and actually present this performance task towards the beginning of the unit, with the idea that students are then to work towards this performance task over time. And so they may know that what all they're doing in the class on any given day is to prepare them for later on to perform well in a performance test. So we have an essential question here that really looks at the differences between having students distinguish between what is a good diet based on established research and versus one's own eating habits. And the idea here is that students are to investigate online and to be critical of online sources so that they are finding research that supports what they view as and what the experts view as a healthy dietary plan. So the goal of this particular performance task is that learners will design a dietary plan based on the individual's routines, dietary preferences, and medical requirements. Okay, so one of the things that I work with teachers about when talking about performance tasks is the idea of a goal and how important it is to establish an authentic goal. One of the tendencies that I see English language teachers do, which is my context, is that we typically focus on the language goal. As language teachers, we think in terms of grammatical structures maybe. Maybe we focus on some sort of pronunciation challenges. Maybe we are focusing on other domains, vocabulary, for example, and even the different skills if we're looking at reading, writing, listening, speaking. But the idea here at this level of the performance task is to try to think of an authentic goal, one that is not necessarily related directly to language. Of course, we're going to have other goals that are very specific in nature that are going to deal with language, but the idea again at this level is to create an authentic goal, one that a person might find out in the real world. Okay, so the next aspect here, the role. So students here, in this particular case, students will assume the role of a nutritionist. Okay, so any type of expert in the field that is likely to deal with dietary considerations, dietary plans. Nutritionist is something that came to mind when designing this particular performance task. The audience, anyone who has health challenges and who would benefit from eating a healthy diet. So we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about what that might mean here in the actual learning sequence. But again, the idea here is to choose a role in an audience that is as authentic as possible. And in this particular case, basically anyone that they might know that is seeking dietary advice. Now, the next element here, situation or context. So in this particular case, someone comes to you, a nutritionist, and seeks your expertise in developing a dietary plan that is sustainable, healthy, and one that can be adhered to given the client's busy schedule. So I've tried to build in this particular context some challenges. One that we typically face, where we have someone who is needing advice, who is seeking to maybe improve their diet, but has maybe particular ways of eating that is not necessarily healthy, and they have a busy schedule. So whatever dietary plan that they end up using has to be practical, has to be something that can be sustainable, that they can adhere to over a period of time. Now, the next element here really is, I break it down into three different sections here, and this is based on again Wiggins and McTighe's literature and books that they've written about. I've slightly adapted this one to include purpose as well. I think that it's very important that students really know why they're doing a certain activity. What's the long-term goal? What's the short-term goal? And I think with the design of a performance task, that making sure that the purpose of that task is clear and explicit to the students. In this case, the purpose is to tailor a dietary plan through learning both what experts say is a good diet and how practical the diet will be for one who holds a busy lifestyle. All right, so again, this links back to the context mentioned above. A lot of these elements are closely related, and the main purpose here is that there's an authentic task that one can easily view as something that would happen again in the real world. The learners may choose now to work in pairs. So thinking about the process, there are many different ways to interpret this performance task when considering what kind of interactional patterns we're going to be expecting our learners to undertake. So here, of course, we want to have some opportunities for learners to work in pairs and small groups, even individually at times. And here the idea is not to dictate or even perhaps suggest one way of having students work together, but more reflect on your own context and see at what point would it be most appropriate for learners to be able to work in these different types of processes. Now, process also relates to the actual process of creating whatever it is that needs to be created. So it's not just how they work socially, but it's also the steps that they are going to take. And here in a second, I'm going to provide a learning sequence, but without necessarily indicating a process. So again, the process, they may decide on first doing this and then doing something else related to, let's say they're going to create a brochure or create a video. They might set up roles for each of them. Each of the learners might decide who's going to take on what kind of role, and then who's going to do what first, and how all the pieces kind of relate together, so to speak. So process can relate to both interactional patterns, and also it can relate to the process, the academic process of creating a particular product. Our last P, product, then also we want to give them some level of flexibility in deciding perhaps on what kind of products they are to complete. Again, this is going to depend very much on the level, maturity level, and even the comfort level of the teacher. But the idea here is that there are options, there are ways to differentiate the instruction in a way that process and product, as well as content and environment, all of these things, there are some flexibility in the way that the actual day-to-day activities and the learning that can take place. So with the products, they can choose perhaps brochures, videos, posters, among other things, many different possibilities when looking at not only this particular performance task, but any performance task, what kind of products students are to complete. The learning processes and products will depend on the learner, of course, and the degree with which differentiated instruction is employed. So I throw in differentiated instruction with the idea that much of the decisions that we're going to make in terms of process and product are going to depend very much on the level of differentiation that is part of the day-to-day class. So I think it's worth mentioning a quick review of differentiated instruction, again looking at how to differentiate content, process, product, and environment. Environment mainly being social media or the online spaces students are using to interact and to engage in the content, as well as with their peers, their classmates, even outside experts. Okay, the next section, standards, criteria. The dietary plan must differentiate between what is healthy based on the literature and what is considered a quote cheat meal. Food that is not exactly healthy, but something the client is likely not to give up. So I'm building in some sort of criteria, a consideration, so that students are aware of the fact that they're not only to try to create a dietary plan for someone, but make it practical, make it sustainable, something that the client is, or the patient is going to actually adhere to. And usually this might mean, at least at first, building in some sort of way in which the patient is able to eat some things that he or she is really wanting to eat, and that might not be part of the healthy dietary plan. So the idea is to take that in consideration, that's going to be a challenge, and we're going to build that into the standards or the criteria, things that we, the instructors, are going to be looking for when we evaluate whether or not it was a successful performance task, or whether it was a performance task that met our expectations. A successful performance task will include equal involvement among all learners, and will also include products that are appropriate for the client. So again, the standards here is basically going to include how the learners, or how much the learners are going to know about the client and take their client's needs and preferences into consideration when they develop the dietary plan. That it's not going to be just one stock dietary plan, that it's going to be very much tailor-made, again, to the needs and interests of the patient. Now, this final section, learning design sequence, is not officially part of the GRASP framework, but it's something that I outline. And this is very reminiscent of a performance task, or I'm sorry, project-based type of approach. And I say that very loosely in the sense that I've jotted down 4 general types of activities that seem to be logical, or at least could be possible for this type of performance task. Again, this is going to be depending very much on the instructor, but the idea here is to begin by